The final sound she would ever hear from that life was the click of a well-oiled lock, a sound too small and neat for the severing of a world. Elara stood on the gray stone steps of the county wardship, the place that had been her container for 18 years, and felt the vibration of that small metallic finality travel up through the soles of her worn shoes and into her bones. The door, a heavy oak slab painted an unforgiving shade of institutional green, was now a wall. Behind it was the only life she had known, a life of timetables and shared rooms and the constant, low hum of managed existence. Before her lay the world, a vast and indifferent expanse of sky the color of dishwater, spitting a cold, persistent drizzle that was more mist than rain. She was, in the sterile and clipped language of the state, officially emancipated. The word felt like a lie, a cruel joke whispered in a vacuum. She had not been freed, she had been jettisoned. In her hand, she clutched a thin manila envelope, its contents the sum total of her worldly inheritance. The senior administrator, a man whose face was a collection of tired, sagging lines, had pushed it across his polished desk without making eye contact. Inside, there was a sheaf of banknotes amounting to $112, a sum so precise in its inadequacy that it felt more like an insult than a provision. Alongside the money lay a brittle, yellowed deed, the paper so fragile it threatened to turn to dust in her grip. It granted her ownership of a parcel of land in the far northern territories, a place identified only by a series of grim-sounding coordinates and the colloquial name, Vance's Folly. The administrator had offered a dry, humorless chuckle when he read the name, a small, rattling sound in his throat. It was a worthless plot, he had informed her, a collapsed ruin on a windswept mountain left by some mad ancestor. A final, parting jest from a lineage she had never known. The last item in the envelope was a key. It was not a small, modern thing of brass or steel, but a heavy, baroque piece of rusted iron, its teeth complex and archaic, its shaft pitted with age. It felt less like a key and more like a fossil, a relic from a time when locks were meant to guard something more substantial than empty rooms. The journey north was a descent, not in altitude, but in hope. It began with a rumbling, shuddering bus that smelled of damp wool and disinfectant, its windows weeping with condensation that obscured a landscape already intent on being forgotten. The rolling green hills of her youth flattened into gray, stony plains, which in turn gave way to a ragged coastline where the sea clawed at the land with a miserable, perpetual anger. From the coast, another, smaller bus carried her inland, climbing into the foothills of a great mountain range that stood like a row of broken teeth against the bruised purple of the horizon. The few passengers who shared the rattling vehicle were hard-faced and silent, wrapped in thick coats and a deeper layer of stoic resignation. They looked at her thin jacket and the threadbare pack at her feet, with a brief flicker of something that might have been pity, but was more likely a simple, dispassionate acknowledgement of another soul bound for hardship. The world outside grew more severe with every mile, the trees becoming stunted and twisted, clinging to the rocky slopes like desperate supplicants. The colors bled out of the land, leaving only the stark trinity of gray rock, brown earth, and the eventual, shocking white of the first snows clinging to the high peaks. The bus deposited her at a crossroads marked by a single, leaning signpost whose destinations had been scoured away by decades of wind and ice. From there, the directions on the deed indicated a long walk, a final pilgrimage on foot up a winding track that was more of a goat path than a road. The air grew thin and sharp, each breath a small, cold pain in her lungs. With her was a scruffy, black dog named Cinder, a creature of indeterminate breed who had attached himself to her in the final weeks at the wardship, a silent shadow of loyalty she had not asked for but could not bring herself to refuse. He trotted ahead, his paws silent on the packed earth, his presence the only spot of warmth in the vast, cold emptiness. The track climbed relentlessly, and with every step, the feeling of isolation intensified, becoming a physical pressure against her chest. The wind began to speak, no longer a whisper but a low, mournful moan that snaked through the jagged rock formations and skeletal trees. It was a predator, this wind, and she was an intruder in its domain, a small, soft thing that had wandered foolishly into a place of stone and ice. This was not just a journey to a piece of land. It was an exile to the very edge of the world. When she finally saw it, the reality was so much worse than the administrator's casual dismissal had prepared her for. Vance's folly was not a house. It was a wound in the landscape. The ruin stood on a barren plateau, a jagged skeleton of stone walls and charred, splintered timbers silhouetted against the unforgiving sky. What might have once been a roof had long ago surrendered to gravity and rage. Its remains a chaotic jumble on the floor within the crumbling perimeter. Only a single, massive stone chimney still stood, listing to one side like a drunken headstone, a monument to a hearth that had died a century ago. The wind, no longer moaning, now shrieked as it tore through the empty window sockets and over the broken walls, a constant, physical assault that seemed intent on scouring the very memory of the structure from the mountainside. To one side of the ruin, half hidden by a thicket of thorny, leafless bushes, was a dark opening in the earth, a crude maw framed by rotting timbers and sealed with a lattice of heavy, weathered planks. It was the entrance to an old mine, a black pit that seemed to exhale a palpable cold, a damp, mineral breath from deep within the mountain's gut. This was her inheritance, not a home, but a grave. For 3 days, despair was a physical state, a paralysis that rooted her to the most sheltered corner of the ruin. She huddled there, wrapped in her thin blanket, with cinder pressed against her for shared warmth, a small, living furnace in the encroaching cold. She managed to build a small, pathetic fire in the lee of the great chimney's base, feeding it with scraps of rotted which she scavenged from the debris. It was a miserable thing, a sputtering, smoky flame that offered little light and even less heat, consuming its fuel with a desperate hunger that she could not possibly sustain. The smoke, caught by the swirling eddies of the wind, stung her eyes and choked her, a constant, acrid reminder of her own futility. Her meager supply of food, a few loaves of stale bread, a wedge of hard cheese, a handful of dried apples, was dwindling at an alarming rate. The cold was a living entity, a patient hunter that seeped through her clothes, through her skin, and into the very marrow of her bones. It whispered to her in the long, dark hours of the night, its voice the howling of the wind. It told her to give up, to simply lie down, to close her eyes, and to let the cold take her. It was a seductive thought, a promise of an end to the shivering, the hunger, and the crushing weight of her own solitude. Surrender felt like a soft, easy thing, a final letting go. On the 4th morning, something shifted. She awoke from a fitful, dreamless sleep to a world encased in a thin, crystalline layer of frost. The fire was dead, a circle of black ash. The wind had momentarily died down, and in the profound silence, the world felt brittle and new. She watched Cinder, who sat patiently, his tail giving a single, hopeful thump against the frozen ground when her eyes opened. He trusted her. In his dark, intelligent eyes, there was no despair, only a simple, unwavering faith that she would provide, that she would solve this. And then, beyond him, she saw it. Pushing its way up through a crack in a flat stone was a single, tiny wildflower, a speck of defiant purple in a world of gray and brown. It was a thing of impossible fragility, yet it was here, in this place of death and decay, alive and unbowed. The sight of it, so small and so utterly resolute, did not fill her with hope. It filled her with a sudden, boiling rage. It was a hot, clean, clarifying anger that burned away the fog of despair. Rage at the administrator, at the faceless system that had discarded her, at the smug finality of that closing door, at the ancestor who had built this monument to failure, and most of all, at her own weakness for having considered surrender. The wildflower was not surrendering. The dog was not surrendering. She would not surrender. She would fight. The first act of her rebellion was one of pure, mindless physicality. She stood up, her stiff limbs protesting, and grabbed the largest piece of fallen timber she could lift. Grunting with the effort, she heaved it from the interior of the ruin and threw it onto a growing pile outside the crumbling walls. Then she grabbed another, and another. For the rest of the day, she worked without stopping, her body fueled by the fire of her newfound anger. She cleared debris, her hands, raw and uncalloused, quickly blistering and then bleeding as she clawed at splintered wood and sharp-edged stones. She ignored the pain. It was a welcome sensation, a sharp, grounding reality that was infinitely preferable to the dull, numbing ache of hopelessness. She was not rebuilding. She was not even thinking about a plan. She was simply imposing order on chaos, one rock, one plank at a time. It was a war against entropy, a declaration that this small patch of the world would not be left to the wind and the decay. As she worked, her mind, which for days had been a swamp of self-pity, became blessedly quiet. There was only the scrape of stone on stone, the wrench of rotten wood, the rhythm of her own breathing, and the steady, thudding beat of her own furious heart. By dusk, a significant section of the ruin's floor was cleared, and she was slick with sweat despite the cold, every muscle in her body screaming in protest. She was exhausted, but for the first time since her arrival, she felt alive. Cinder had spent the day with a peculiar, single-minded focus of his own. While Elara had been wrestling with the larger debris, he had been sniffing and scratching at the boarded-up mine entrance, occasionally letting out a low, frustrated whine. He kept vanishing behind the thorny bushes, his digging sounds a faint, persistent counterpoint to her own labors. His obsession with the spot was unsettling, and as the light began to fail, she decided to investigate. She pushed through the sharp branches, her clothes snagging, and saw that his efforts had exposed more of the structure. The planks sealing the entrance were thick and ancient, held in place by massive iron spikes driven deep into the timber frame. But at the base, where Cinder had been digging, the earth was soft and had fallen away, revealing a dark gap beneath the lowest plank. As she watched, the dog wriggled his way through the opening and disappeared into the blackness with a muffled yip. A cold knot of fear tightened in her stomach. She called his name, her voice sounding thin and small against the vastness of the mountain. There was no response. It was in that moment of panic, scrambling at the loose dirt around the entrance, that her fingers struck something hard and unyielding. It was not stone. It was metal. Forgetting the dog for a moment, she clawed at the earth with a frantic energy, her raw fingers digging into the cold, damp soil. She unearthed the corner of a heavy, metal-bound box, its surface pitted and corroded but still intact. It was large and rectangular, and it took her the better part of an hour, using a flat stone as a makeshift trowel, to excavate it completely. She dragged it from its shallow grave, her muscles straining. The box was sealed with a heavy, intricate lock, green with verdigris. And as she stared at it, a flicker of memory, a jolt of connection, shot through her. The key. The heavy, rusted iron key from the envelope. Her hands trembled as she retrieved it from her pack. She slid it into the keyhole, the fit surprisingly snug despite the rust and age. It took all her strength to turn it, the metal grinding in protest, a long, groaning shriek that seemed to echo from another time. With a final, loud clank, the mechanism gave way. Just as she lifted the heavy lid, Cinder squirmed back out from under the planking, his coat covered in dirt and cobwebs, and trotted over to lick her hand, as if his brief subterranean adventure had been nothing at all. The contents of the chest were wrapped in oilcloth, a dark, stiff material that crackled as she unfolded it. The air inside was dry and musty, the smell of old paper and leather preserved against the mountain's dampness. There were two items. The first was a thick, leather-bound journal, its cover stamped with the initials E.V. The second was a tight roll of schematics, drawn with precise, architectural lines on heavy vellum. She opened the journal, her heart pounding. The handwriting was elegant and forceful, the ink faded from black to a deep, rusty brown. It was the journal of her great-grandfather, Elias Vance, the man the world had dismissed as a fool. For hours, she sat by her small, rekindled fire, Cinder asleep at her feet, and read. She read of a man who was not a madman, but a brilliant scientist and engineer, a visionary born a century too early. He had not come to this mountain to fail, but to conduct an experiment of profound genius. He wrote of the tyranny of the flame, of how conventional heating was a constant, losing battle against the cold, a ravenous beast that demanded endless fuel. His obsession was with a different kind of warmth, constant, gentle, and drawn from the very bones of the earth. The schematics, when she unrolled them, laid out his vision in breathtaking detail. He had called it the Ethelberg system. It was a design for a shelter that worked in harmony with nature, not against it. It was not a house to be built upon the land, but a structure to be integrated with it. The core of the system was the massive stone chimney, which he had not intended for a conventional fireplace. It was the heart of a high-mass masonry stove, a cachalophin, designed to absorb the heat of a single, hot, fast-burning fire and then radiate that warmth slowly and evenly for days. This thermal battery was only one part of the equation. The second, more radical component, involved the old, abandoned mine. The diagrams showed a complex loop of sealed pipes, made of clay and copper, that would run from the base of the shelter deep into the mine shaft. The mine, insulated by thousands of tons of rock, maintained a constant, year-round temperature, far warmer than the winter air outside. The system was a passive geothermal heat exchange. A small, solar-powered pump, or even a clever convection design, would circulate a fluid, or simply air, through the loop, drawing the deep, gentle warmth of the earth up into the living space, preheating the air and creating a stable, comfortable environment with an astonishingly small amount of fuel. Elias Vance had not built a folly. He had been building a masterpiece of thermodynamic elegance. A new plan, audacious and overwhelming, took root in her mind, displacing all thoughts of simple survival. She would not rebuild the ruin. She would not try to patch the holes and fight the wind with planks and nails. She would complete her great-grandfather's work. His journal contained not only the grand theory, but also meticulously detailed instructions, a step-by-step guide to construction, a list of materials, and calculations of thermal mass and airflow. He had already quarried and shaped most of the necessary stone. He had dug the foundations. The ruin was not a failure. It was a project interrupted. The plan was utterly contrary to every notion of construction she knew. It involved sealing off most of the broken structure, creating a smaller, semi-subterranean living space, a fortress of stone and earth built against the sheltered side of the chimney mass. It would be more like a hobbit hole than a house, with one thick, insulated wall facing outward and the rest buffered by the earth itself. It was an immense, terrifying undertaking, but for the first time, she had more than just rage. She had a purpose. The journey back down the mountain and into the small, wind-beaten town that huddled in the valley was a different experience. She was still gaunt, her face smudged with dirt and her hands a mess of cuts and blisters. But she walked with a new kind of intensity, a focused fire in her eyes that made the few people she passed on the main street stare. The town was a place of practicality, of thick walls and steep roofs designed to shed snow. Its heart was the general store, a sprawling wooden building that sold everything from flour and salted meat to ironmongery and woolen socks. It was a place that smelled of sawdust, coffee, and the faint, metallic tang of cold iron. Her list, transcribed carefully from Elias's journal, was clutched in her hand. It was a strange collection of items, specific grades of fireclay and mortar, lengths of copper pipe, sheets of mica for a sealed stove door, and various sealants and gaskets. She knew her $112 would not be enough. Not even close. As she stood at the counter, a large, barrel-chested man with a florid face and a booming voice approached. This was Master Balin, a name she had heard spoken with a mixture of respect and resentment in the town. He was the largest landowner, a member of the town council, and a man whose opinion carried the weight of iron. He glanced at her list, then at her, his lips curling into a condescending smirk. He announced to the store at large that another fool had come to die on Vance's mountain. He picked up her list and read from it with theatrical scorn. Copper pipe? For what? To plumb the wind. Fireclay? You'll need a forest of firewood to heat that pile of rocks, not a bag of fancy mud. He gave her loud, patronizing advice, telling her to forget her nonsense, buy a cord of wood and a good cast-iron stove, and pray she lasted until the first big snow. His words were meant to crush her, to humiliate her into abandoning her ridiculous project. They hammered against her, each syllable a blow. But beneath the sting of his public mockery, her resolve did not crack. It tempered, hardening from a hot, impulsive anger into something cold, dense, and unbreakable. She met his gaze, her expression unreadable, and simply waited for him to finish. The store's proprietor, an elderly man named Silas, had been watching the exchange from behind the counter, his face a mask of leathery wrinkles. He was thin and stooped, with hands that were gnarled and stained from a lifetime of work. When Balin had finally exhausted his tirade and stormed away, Silas took the list from her. He studied it for a long time, his pale blue eyes tracing the strange items. He looked at her hands, at the raw, brutalized state of them, and then back at her face, at the unyielding set of her jaw. He tallied the cost of the materials, his pencil scratching on a pad of paper. The final sum was, as she had expected, more than 3 times what she possessed. She laid her small wad of cash on the counter without a word. Silas looked at the money, then back at her. "This is a fool's gamble," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "That mountain will kill you." But then he paused, his gaze lingering on her. "Still, there's grit in you. I've seen men with twice your muscle and half your stomach break up there." He tapped the pencil on the counter, the sound a small, steady rhythm in the quiet store. "I'll make you a wager, girl. I'll extend you the credit. You pay me back when you can. But if that mountain claims you, your debt is paid." It was not an act of charity. It was a challenge, a wager on her tenacity against the mountain, against Balin's smug certainty, against the world. It was the first time anyone had ever bet on her. A lump formed in her throat, so tight and painful she could not speak. She could only nod, a single, sharp dip of her chin, a silent acceptance of the wager and the validation it represented. The work that followed was a blur of brutal, relentless labor. Hauling the supplies up the mountain track was a Herculean task that took 4 trips, her body pushed to the absolute limits of its endurance. Then came the construction, guided by the ghost of her great-grandfather, his elegant script and precise diagrams her only companions. She learned the language of stone, the heft and balance of each block she wrestled into place. She mixed mortar with her bare hands, the lime and sand scouring her skin, and packed it into the gaps, sealing her small fortress against the wind. She followed the plans for the masonry stove with a religious devotion, building the complex, convoluted flue system that would trap the heat within the stone mass. The most difficult part was installing the geothermal loop. She had to unseal the mine entrance, pry away the ancient planks, and venture into the suffocating darkness, Cinder whining with anxiety at the entrance. The air inside was still and cold, but it was a dead, stable cold, nothing like the living, biting cold of the surface. With a lantern and the schematics, she laid the copper pipes along the walls of the main shaft, a long, looping circuit that descended deep into the earth, a metal artery designed to drink the planet's latent warmth. Every day was a race against the sun, a battle against her own screaming muscles and the encroaching autumn chill. She grew leaner, harder, her body a tool shaped by its task, her mind a quiet space occupied only by the logic of stone, mortar, and heat. News of the coming storm arrived not as a whisper, but as a shout. A trapper, half mad with fear, came down from the high passes with stories of unprecedented snows in the back country and a wind that sounded like the world screaming. Meteorologists in the distant cities, using their new and sophisticated instruments, gave the storm a name, the Wolf Winter. They called it a blizzard of the century, a meteorological anomaly of terrifying scale and power. The town in the valley, which had for weeks treated Elara's project as a source of morbid amusement, was now gripped by a cold, frantic fear. The frenzy of preparation was led, of course, by Master Balin. His voice boomed in the town square, directing the community's efforts with an air of absolute authority. The solution, in his mind, was simple: brute force. He organized teams to fell every available dead tree for miles around, creating a vast, sprawling woodpile in the center of town. He preached the gospel of the roaring fire, of stockpiling fuel for the conventional cast iron stoves that sat in every home. More is more, he declared. We will fight this winter with fire and overwhelm it with our industry. The townspeople, caught in his confident certainty, scrambled to obey, their days filled with the screech of saws and the crack of splitting axes. Elara's preparations were a study in contrast. While the town thundered with activity, her small corner of the mountain was quiet and methodical. She had no need for a mountain of wood. Her own pile, stacked neatly against the wall of her shelter, was shockingly small, little more than what a normal family might burn in a week. It was comprised of seasoned, dry hardwood, cut to precise lengths as Elias's journal instructed, designed for a single, efficient, hot burn. She spent her final days not on gathering fuel, but on perfecting the seals of her home. She caulked every joint, packed every seam with insulating moss and clay, ensuring her small bastion was as airtight as a bottle. Her final act was one of strange, quiet ceremony. On the afternoon before the sky turned a bruised and menacing gray, she loaded the firebox of the masonry stove. She lit the fire, and as the schematics had promised, it roared to life, the draft from the tall chimney pulling the air with a hungry sound. For 3 hours, she fed it, keeping the blaze as hot and clean as possible. The exterior of the massive stone structure barely grew warm to the touch, but she knew that deep inside its core, a tremendous reservoir of heat was building, the stone absorbing BTUs by the tens of thousands. Then, following the final instruction, she let the fire die to embers, sealed the insulated firebox door, and closed the chimney flue damper. The system was now charged. Her home was a sealed thermal battery. There was nothing left to do but wait. She and Cinder curled up on a bed of pine boughs and blankets, and listened as the first whispers of the storm began to arrive. The wolf winter did not arrive. It fell. It was as if the sky simply collapsed, loosing a solid, vertical wall of white that erased the world. The wind became a physical thing, a solid presence that slammed into the mountain with the force of a tidal wave, its sound a constant, deafening shriek that vibrated through the rock itself. In the town below, the first few hours were a time of grim confidence. Every stove was lit, every chimney belching smoke, the woodpiles shrinking at a steady rate. But the storm's fury was beyond anything they had imagined. The sheer velocity of the wind created a powerful downdraft, forcing smoke back down chimneys, filling houses with a blinding, choking haze. The conventional iron stoves, designed to radiate heat constantly, were ravenous. They devoured wood at an appalling rate, their roaring fires sucking vast quantities of heated air out of the very rooms they were meant to warm, pulling in drafts of super-chilled air through every crack and crevice. By the second day, confidence had curdled into fear. The woodpiles were dwindling with terrifying speed. The cold was winning. It infiltrated the houses, coating windows with thick, opaque layers of ice, turning rooms not heated directly by a stove into frozen chambers. The generators that powered the few electric heaters sputtered and died as their fuel lines froze. The mood shifted from struggle to desperation. Families huddled in single rooms, feeding their hungry stoves with furniture, with books, with anything that would burn, fighting a losing battle against a cold that was absolute. In Elara's shelter, there was no battle. There was only a profound and penetrating silence. The shriek of the wind outside was a distant, muted thing, the rage of a predator that could not find its way in. The thick stone and earth walls absorbed the storm's violence, leaving the interior preternaturally still. And it was warm. It was not the scorching, dry heat of an iron stove, but a gentle, pervasive warmth that radiated from the massive masonry core at the heart of the dwelling. The stones, still saturated with the heat of the single fire she had burned days ago, released their energy slowly, evenly, warming the very air, the floors, the walls. The geothermal loop, its slow convection a silent, invisible engine, drew a steady current of pre-warmed air from the Earth's depths, feeding it into the sealed space and ensuring the temperature never dropped below a comfortable level. There was no smoke, no drafts, no ravenous consumption of fuel. There was only peace. Elara slept, read her great-grandfather's journal by the light of a single candle, and shared her food with Cinder, a small island of calm and security in the heart of the world's fury. The system worked. It worked perfectly. Elias Vance had not been a fool. He had been a prophet. The storm raged for 6 days. On the 7th, the world awoke to a stunning and absolute silence. Elara pushed open her heavy, insulated door against a drift of snow and stepped out into a landscape transformed. The sky was a brilliant, painful blue, and the sun shone on a world buried under a dozen feet of pure white powder. The air was so cold it felt like shattered glass in her lungs, but it was still and clean. From the single, narrow vent pipe that emerged from her roof, a faint, shimmering heat haze rose into the crystalline air, the only sign of the life and warmth contained within the hill. Her shelter was no longer a structure on the landscape, but a part of it, a gentle, snow-covered mound that seemed to have grown from the mountain itself. She stood there for a long time, the only living thing visible for miles, a solitary figure in a world that had been scoured clean and put to sleep under a blanket of white. It was a beautiful and lethal world, and she was entirely safe within it. Down in the valley, the survivors emerged from their frigid homes like ghosts. The town was devastated. The great woodpile was gone, and the cold had claimed livestock, ruined provisions, and left a deep, lasting trauma on the people. After 2 days of digging out, a small party was organized to trek up the mountain. It was led by Balin, his face grim and frost-nipped, his usual bluster frozen into a brittle shell of denial. He was going, he told everyone, to recover the poor girl's body. Silas, the store owner, insisted on coming along, his face etched with a quiet, personal worry. The journey was an arduous struggle through immense drifts, the men sinking to their chests in the powder. When they finally reached the plateau of Vance's Folly, they stopped and stared in confusion. There was no ruin. There was only a smooth, deep mound of snow, from which the top of a single stone chimney protruded. They were about to turn back, assuming the structure had collapsed entirely, when Silas pointed. He had seen it. A faint, impossible shimmer in the air, rising from a small pipe they had almost missed. A heat haze. They dug frantically, their shovels biting into the deep, light snow. They uncovered the top of a heavy wooden door set into the side of the mound. Balin, full of a grim certainty, put his shoulder to it, expecting it to be frozen shut. It swung inward with surprising ease. A solid, palpable wall of warmth rolled out of the opening, so dense and startling it felt like a living thing. The men, their faces and beards caked with ice, recoiled in disbelief. They peered into the dim interior and saw her. Elara was sitting on the floor, calmly mending a tear in her jacket, with Cinder asleep beside her. The air in the small space was warm and dry. A pot of water was simmering gently on a small hook set into the side of the massive stone structure that dominated the room. She was not merely surviving. She was comfortable. She was thriving. She looked up at the circle of stunned, ice-rimmed faces staring in from the blinding white world and offered them a simple, quiet nod of greeting. Balin stumbled into the space, his eyes wide with a profound, world-shattering disbelief. How? The word was a choked, strangled whisper. His entire worldview, built on the principles of brute force, loud confidence, and conventional wisdom, had just been demolished by a silent, half-buried room and a slip of a girl he had dismissed as a fool. How is this possible? There is no fire. Your woodpile is barely touched. Elara looked at the man who had publicly mocked and condemned her. She felt no triumph, no desire for revenge. There was only a great, quiet stillness in her heart. She explained it to him in simple terms, her voice even and calm. She spoke of thermal mass, of how the stone held the memory of a fire long after it was out. She explained how the deep earth offered its warmth freely, how the shelter did not fight the cold but simply sidestepped it, using the mountain itself as a shield. She spoke of her great-grandfather's genius, not with pride, but with a simple, declarative respect. As she spoke, the other men listened, their expressions shifting from confusion to awe. Balin's authority, which had been as solid and imposing as a block of granite, evaporated in the gentle warmth of that room. It turned to steam and vanished, leaving behind only a hollow, humiliated man. He turned without another word and pushed his way out into the cold. He left the town a week later, unable to bear the weight of his own public, catastrophic failure. The story of the girl who had tamed the wolf Winter spread through the valley and then to the surrounding territories. Her status was transformed overnight. She was no longer the outcast, the pitiable orphan. She became a figure of awe, a local legend. In the weeks and months that followed, people began to make the pilgrimage up the mountain to her home. They did not come to gawk, but to learn. They came with questions, with notebooks, with a new and profound humility. They saw her small, efficient woodpile, the brilliant simplicity of her home, and they understood that their entire approach to survival had been wrong. It was not about how much fuel you could burn, but how much warmth you could keep. Elara, the girl who had barely spoken a word to anyone, became a teacher. She shared the knowledge from Elias Vance's journal freely, patiently explaining the principles of the Ethelberg system to weathered farmers and skeptical builders. She did not charge for this knowledge. It was a legacy, and it belonged to the mountain and to anyone who was willing to listen to its wisdom. Years passed. The town and the valley changed. Slowly at first, then with gathering momentum, the houses began to incorporate the old, forgotten wisdom. New homes were built with masonry cores, oriented to the south, insulated with earth and straw. The old mine shafts that dotted the region, once seen as dangerous liabilities, were re-examined as potential sources of geothermal energy. The community, once reliant on a frantic, yearly struggle to stockpile enough fuel to survive, became more resilient, more secure, living in greater comfort with less effort. They learned to work with the winter, not wage war against it. Elara remained in her shelter on the mountain, a quiet, respected matriarch, the custodian of a wisdom that had been dismissed as folly. She never sought power or acclaim, yet she had become the most influential person in the region. Her life was a testament to a simple, profound truth, that true strength is not found in loud assertions of power or in the brute force of industry, but in the quiet, patient, and intelligent application of wisdom. It is found in listening to the whispers of the past, in seeing the profound and hidden value in the things and people that the world has seen fit to discard.